And welcome back to the CritMedic podcast. I'm your host, Dominic Wallenczak. And this time, we're going to talk about something that really matters to a lot of people, which is resuscitation and end outcomes. We talked a little bit about outcomes and how people value their importance in the podcast about epinephrine and how it doesn't have a lot of appreciable impact on long-term care. So, this time we're going to talk about determining prognosticators of end outcome for cardiac arrest. Now, if you're like me, we've all encountered situations where we've worked a cardiac arrest and only to have them unfortunately expire in the emergency department or after admission. But what prognosticators are there to tell us that these patients aren't going to ultimately make it? Well, there's some criteria that's available that can help us determine a little bit more about this. Now, I make a little bit of light of this, a little bit of gallows humor, googly eyes on a skeleton. But this is actually a fairly important topic. So let's talk about one of the criteria that people always talk about, and that is fixed dilated pupils. And you'll hear that from emergency department physicians, other paramedics. You'll hear people say, well, we've got pulses back, but the pupils are fixed and dilated, so there's not a lot of hope. Is that really accurate necessarily in the early post-ROSC period? Well, we can find out by doing a review of literature. What does the world's literature say about this? Well, the world's literature happens to say this is one of the studies that was done. It's called the Early Absent Pupillary Reflex After Cardiac Arrest in Patients Treated with Therapeutic Hypothermia. Now, this was specially geared towards hypothermia patients, but what they found was that of 99 patients studied, I believe this was over at the Mayo Clinic, 29 of them had unreactive pupils immediately post-arrest. 8 of those 29 developed reactive pupils by 72 hours. And 2 of those 8 had good neurologic outcomes. A full quarter of them had good neurologic outcomes. The overall survival rate for the people who had initially unresponsive pupils is about 6.9%. Which might not sound like a lot, but you have to keep in mind that the overall survival rate for cardiac arrest is only about 9-10% in general. So this is actually not that bad of a survival rate. And if we can optimize our care to make sure we capture the 6.9% additional survival, we can help try and improve the overall cardiac arrest save rate. So maybe that's not a big enough study. Let's take a look at this study. This looked at 73,000 out-of-hospital cardiac arrest patients in France. And this specifically looked at the 10,000 who were admitted to the hospital, who they had data on, and who weren't immediately woken up and able to talk, because that you can't really use pupil reflex at that point. So this looked at 10,151 patients in the immediate post-arrest period. And they find that 64% of them have absent pupillary reflex on admission. That's more than half. Well, obviously, mathematically, that's more than half. And of those, 9.5% have good neurologic outcomes, the same as the overall cardiac arrest save rate with good neurologic outcomes. So this study eventually came to the conclusion that prognostic performance of the absence of pupillary light reflex upon hospital admission is insufficient as criteria for discontinuing resuscitation. So, what about the sensitivity and specificity of this? It has a sensitivity of 72%. That means it picks up, pupillary light reflex picks up 72% of those who don't have good outcomes. So, of that percentage that end up dying and have poor neurologic outcomes, 72% of them will have absent pupillary reflex. However, more concerning is the specificity. The specificity is how accurate is it to just that particular population? How specific is it to be able to predict that and not include false positives? In this particular case, the specificity is only 69%. That's not really that much better than a coin flip, which would be 50%. are we really comfortable with basing our entire resuscitation, whether they're going to continue to provide care for them or withdrawal life-saving care in the ICU or emergency department, based on something that's marginally more accurate than a coin flip, 69%? Well, there is some criteria that's available from the American Heart Association guidelines. They took a look at all the data that was available, and in 2015, this was the latest guideline that they published. They published that if you are using therapeutic hypothermia, the earliest time for prognostication on clinical examination in patients treated with therapeutic temperature management, where sedation and paralysis could be a confounding factor in the overall neurologic assessment, should be about 72 hours. And they say, we recommend the earliest time to prognosticate, that's a mouthful right there, a poor neurologic outcome using clinical examinations in patients not treated with therapeutic temperature management or targeted temperature management is 72 hours after cardiac arrest. That means immediately after you get pulses back, 15 minutes later in the emergency department, that's not really the time to be able to figure out, is this patient going to have a good outcome? Because those assessments are not accurate. So what is adequate criteria in the post-arrest period? At 72 hours, what can we use? We can use factors like pupillary light reflex, which has a 2.1% false positive rate. Now, I know I've been saying that pupil light reflex isn't an accurate criteria, and it's not immediately after arrest. But after 72 hours, if you do not have some sort of pupil light reflex, 98% of the time, it's most likely that you're not going to have a good neurologic outcome. You're supposed to have some sort of pupil reaction to light at 72 hours. And if you don't, that could be an indicator that you have some severe brainstem damage. Same thing with corneal reflex. It works on the same brain center and has a false positive rate of about 2.2%. So they recommend using more than one criteria to try and help figure out if this patient is going to ultimately survive. So 2.2%, that's pretty good. If you use both of those, you get a fairly decent assessment. There's also the topic of using the GCS score to try and figure out if they have a successful outcome. And obviously this is not on sedation and paralytics. And specifically, they found that the most accurate component of the GCS was the motor GCS. Now, there's been some conflicting reports as to whether it has a good or bad false positive rate. One of the studies that I read, I think the top one, indicated that it had a 19.1% false positive rate. It was a relatively small study, and another study said that it had a 0% false positive rate. The truth is probably somewhere in between those figures. There's also other evaluations they can do, like EEG pattern. That has a 3% false positive rate. They'll look and see if they have any sort of abnormal EKGs or if they have any sort of EEGs taking place at all. And if they don't have a normal EEG, that might be an indicator that they don't have a good neurologic function and good neurologic outcomes. There's also serum biomarkers. They can take a look at different biomarkers that are floating around the bloodstream to indicate brain death. And this is sort of the troponin of the neurologic world. You can either find it in the serum, or there's also another test that can be done on cerebrospinal fluid if this particular enzyme is floating around. And that indicates there's a damage. If the markers are bold, it indicates a significant amount of injury. So biomarkers are another one. And another test is the somatosensory evoked potentials. Essentially what this is it's just a little current that's applied to usually both arms, and to see if that stimulus registers on the EEG pattern itself. And if it doesn't register even a blip, well, that means that you're not really processing the sensory information at all. Certain drugs can reduce this a little bit. Things like midazolam has a moderate impact, but it should have still some sort of waveform present. Ironically, things like remifentanil actually dampen this more significantly. Regular analgesics like fentanyl and propofol as a sedative don't really dampen the somatosensory evoked potentials that much. So overall, this is actually a fairly decent assessment that can be done. And it doesn't rely on muscle reflex. So things like paralytics won't affect them. So you could have someone that's paralyzed and sedated and has some analgesia, and you'll still have a decent exam to see if they're able to register this sensory in their brain. And this has a false positive rate of about 0.7%. And there's other criteria that can be taken into account. The circumstances of the arrest, things like bystander CPR, if there was a shockable rhythm initially on arrest. Asystole generally has a poor outcome from people who are on asystole either have serious comorbidities that cause them to be asystolic, or they'd been in arrest for so long that they lost all the electrical energy in their heart, and you're actually starting from further behind. And that usually leads to a higher instance of an anoxia. So the circumstances do have anywhere from 20 to 27 at not only the big picture, but take a look at the variables that are available for assessment. So there's other factors that aren't really included in this. One of the other factors is could MRI as after the arrest. MRIs can also provide some additional pictures MRIs to see the brain activity you have ongoing. And if you don't have anything by the third day, it's an unsuccessful outcome. So this is saying don't give up someone for dead just because their pupillary light reflex is suboptimal or not present initially after your resuscitation. I've seen on multiple instances where you bring in a cardiac arrest, you've resuscitated the patient, but they don't have a good pupillary light reflex. And the attending physician takes one look at the pupils and says, oh, well, the pupils are fixed and dilated. He's not going to survive. We should talk to the family about withdrawing, life-sustaining care. And they'll have this discussion with the family saying, listen, he's alive now, but it doesn't look good from a neurologic standpoint. He's probably not going to make it, or he's going to be a vegetable. Do you want to sign this do not resuscitate order and withdraw care from this patient? And that's something that I have a real issue with. Because these patients, as we see from the data, are ones that actually end up going on to, in some cases, having a full neurologic recovery. And are missing these patients based on our own misinformation about pupillary light reflex in the immediate post-arrest period. So to quote Dr. Hines, don't be a ResusWanker. Don't just say, oh, well, the ABGs aren't looking good, so clearly he doesn't have a likelihood of a good outcome, or the pupillary light reflex isn't good, so he doesn't really have a likelihood of a positive outcome. There is more to the picture, and we have to keep in mind that, especially with the pupils, those might not have a useful prognosticating value for us for the first 72 hours. So that means in the first 72 minutes after arrest, don't use those. Now, I've had calls where, perfect example, we had a cardiac arrest where a gentleman arrested probably within 10 minutes of going outside to take out the garbage. Family thought it was odd that it was taking him quite so long to take out the garbage, so they went out and found him in cardiac arrest. When we arrived, we initiated resuscitation, and after our initial intubation, we actually found that the CO2 value was quite high. It was, I think, around 50 or 60 immediately post-intubation. Great, we might have ROSC, or might already have ROSC. Unfortunately, he didn't really have a perfusing rhythm. I think he had an agonal rhythm, or maybe even asystolic. We continued to do resuscitation measures, and his CO2 stayed high the entire time. The fire department was also rather antsy and chomping at the bit to begin transport. But as we know, transport in cardiac arrest doesn't improve outcomes. In fact, if anything, it worsens outcomes. So we stayed on scene and worked it as long as we could. to the point where we were running out of our epinephrine. Now, we talked about how epinephrine doesn't really make an appreciable difference in overall survival, but it does improve ROSC. But we were running out of our epinephrine, and that's usually a good decision point to say, where are we in the resuscitation? And looking at all the data, he did have a PEA at this point, and we had multiple providers check for pulse points, and everyone agreed that there was no pulse that could be palpated. Could he have some sort of pseudo-PEA? I think it's very likely, especially with the CO2 values being quite high. I was not prepared to end the resuscitation yet at this point, so we made the decision to transport to the local hospital. So that's where things started going a little bit sideways. At the local hospital, we arrived, moved him over to the hospital bed, and now at this point there's no CPR going on. I explained, yes, we've worked this for a significant length of time, but his the downtime was relatively recent. So the attending physician hemmed and hawed. It's like, well, the pupils are fixed and dilated in the middle of cardiac arrest, mind you. I'm not sure what you'd really expect, and I'm not sure what you'd expect from a standpoint of this patient just received 8 milligrams of epinephrine. What do you think the pupils are going to do? Epinephrine has a tendency to dilate pupils, and that's one of the confounders that they considered in all these studies, that giving epinephrine can mask some of the pupillary light reflexes, so it might not be an accurate assessment. So I insisted. I said, listen, recent downtime, his CO2 is still like 40 to 50 at this point. I'm not ready to give up resuscitation. I'd recommend that you continue resuscitation. So the physician agreed to a certain extent, and he agreed to indulge me with giving a further epinephrine. He gave 1 more milligram of epinephrine. Now at this point, the patient is still in asystole or some sort of PEA rhythm. If I recall, it was like a Brady rhythm in the 30s or 40s. And they gave an epinephrine. No pulse was palpated, mind you. So no compressions were being done at this point for some unknown reason. So after a minute, they waited, and the rate came up on the cardiac monitor to maybe like the 50s or 60s. So they palpated a little bit, and they said, oh, we have a pulse. Fantastic, right? Start CPR. Which was quite unusual. I wasn't quite sure of what to make in that situation. That was not something that I'd ever expected to encounter. But after the resuscitation, they managed to get pulses back and sustain some pulses. The physician looked at the pupils and said, oh, the pupils are still fixed and dilated. Let's go to talk to family about, withdrawing care. And granted, nothing else was done quite how I expected, but that was another part of the puzzle that I felt didn't quite suit the patient's care quite adequately. So the moral of the story is, don't be a ResusWanker. Think about all the confounding factors that could affect pupillary all the time. Overall prognosticating. So, the thing today, this is my first happy national dog. And remember, as